Today we're talking about the race to space and science exploration from 1957 to the present day. As Konstantin Tsiolkovsky said, the Earth is the cradle of mankind and one cannot remain in the cradle forever. And so people have had their eyes on space for quite some time. Well, the Russians were the first to make it into space. They launched Sputnik in 1957. This is the first man-made satellite that was going to orbit the world, and people were really surprised about it because Russia kept it very much hush-hush, under wraps, don't tell anybody kind of thing. And so when they actually did it, everybody was like, wow, this is just wild. What are they doing that for? Why do they have that up there? The 1950s were a time when the United States and Russia were in the middle of a Cold War. Very tense between the two countries, very worried that one of them was going to launch nuclear missiles, and it was a very unstable time. And so when this happened and Russia beat us into space, our government started to get pretty worried. It was just 2 months later that Russia launched a second satellite, and they sent a dog into space, and the dog lived through the process. And so, again, they beat us into space. They were a long ways ahead of us technology-wise, and it was making our government very nervous. So we did our first launch into space on January 31st of 1958. We launched a satellite called Explorer 1, and it was launched for scientific purposes. We discovered some really cool things while we were out there with this satellite. We don't have people on it, remember, this is just technology. But we found the radiation belts, the Van Allen radiation belts. And following Explorer 1, we had several unsuccessful launches. We were still figuring out how all of this worked. Well, the Cold War, as I mentioned, had this extreme tension going on between the two major powers of the time. It was the United States and Russia were the big guys. They had the weapons, they had the power, and these advances in space technology started to add fuel to this whole growing hostility. Now, eventually, they got to the point where they began to partner together on some of their endeavors, and it helped to break down some of that tension. But at the start, it definitely was an increase in tension. So prior to this time, we didn't have NASA. NASA was not in existence. Our government, in response to seeing all the stuff that Russia was doing, created NASA in October of 1958. We wanted to beat the Russia in the Cold War game type thing. Remember, the Cold War from your history stuff was not an actual war. We weren't shooting and killing each other. It was just this tension and secrecy and concern that was going on, and a lack of communication going on between the two. So we had the starting of NASA. During the time that we were still developing our program, Russia just kept right on going, and they launched a spacecraft in 1959 that completed the first flyby of the moon, taking a look at what does it look like, how does this work. And it continued on past the moon, and it went into orbit around the sun as well. Then in September of '59, they launched Luna 2. This spacecraft was launched carrying the Soviet coat of arms, and it crash-landed onto the surface of the moon. On April 12th in 1961, Russia launched Vostok 1, and that was carrying the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, and I'm probably not saying his name correctly, but he was the first man in space and successfully entered space and orbited Earth. So again, really getting the United States going, man, come on, we got to do something about this. Well, President Kennedy was in office at the time, and he spoke to the nation at that time, and he just expressed that we were embarrassed that Russia had superior technology. He didn't feel like that was right. We should be in the lead. And he made a commitment at that point, and he said, we will put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And so that put the challenge out there, and that put the pressure on NASA to get going. So he did a special address to Congress on the importance of space on May 25th, 1961. If you'd like to listen to it, you can listen to it on homeofheroes.com at this link here. Feel free to do that. It's a great speech. And so we got our first American into space on February 20th, 1962, and this was astronaut John Glenn. He orbited the Earth 3 times and then safely returned back to Earth again.